When I was 15, something terrifying happened. I'm a petite girl, just about 5 feet 3 inches, with light brown hair and green eyes. I have 2 big dogs, Ranger, a Catahoula and German Shepherd mix, and Shadow, a Labrador and Boxer mix. I often took them for long hikes off-leash on a nearby nature trail. One sunny afternoon during a walk, a man approached me. He seemed unremarkable, around 5 feet 10 inches, with sandy blonde hair and brown eyes. He was wearing a plain black t-shirt and khaki pants. He asked me if I had a match or a lighter. I told him I didn't smoke, so I didn't carry one. He then scanned me up and down and casually asked my name. Feeling uneasy, I lied and said my name was Mia. He proceeded to ask how old I was. I told him I was 15, hoping the truth would deter him. He then asked about my dogs, who were chasing each other a few feet away. After a couple of minutes of this awkward conversation, I attempted to walk away. That's when his comments turned unsettling. He said he found brunettes irresistible and that my green eyes were hypnotic. Unnerved, I brushed past him, my dogs trailing behind. About 20 minutes later, I heard someone shouting, "Mia!" When I turned around, it was him. He jogged up to me, claiming that a woman who looked just like me was calling for me. He offered to take me to her. Instantly, I knew he was lying. My mom doesn't resemble me much, and there's no way she'd use the fake name I'd given him. I told him flatly that I wasn't going with him. My dogs must have sensed my unease because they trotted closer, abandoning their game of fetch. As I moved to leash them and continue walking, the man grabbed me and stabbed something cold and sharp into my side. What happened next was a blur. My dogs erupted into ferocious barking. The man let go of me abruptly. I spun around in time to see Ranger yelp in pain and the man fleeing down the trail. Shadow started chasing him but stopped and returned to my side. I collapsed in shock, but adrenaline kicked in quickly. I checked Ranger, he'd been stabbed as well. Despite the pain in my side, I managed to hoist Ranger onto my shoulders and hurried back home. Thankfully, Ranger survived. He's fully recovered now, but that day left deep scars on me. I've since dyed my hair a deep red. I couldn't bear to look in the mirror without remembering what happened. Even writing this, I feel waves of anxiety. I still walk my dogs, but I avoid that trail entirely. Later, I learned I wasn't the first girl he'd attacked. To this day, he hasn't been caught. If you live in northern Georgia, please be cautious when hiking. There are dangerous people out there. This happened when I was about 19 years old in my small hometown in rural Washington. The town's name was Cedarville, though it's so tiny you've probably never heard of it. Fewer than 800 people lived there, and it had just a diner, a bar, a small grocery store, a park, and a post office. The surrounding area was mostly farmland, and nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Everyone knew everyone. At the time, I wasn't doing much with my life. I didn't have a job or a car, and I still lived at home with my mom. Most of my days were spent sleeping in, playing video games, and hanging out with my friend. In my own eyes, I was a pretty big slacker. My routine rarely changed. Wake up late, chill out at home for a while, then walk to my buddy's place to spend the evening. My friend's house was about 2 miles from mine, and since I didn't drive, I walked the whole way. The walk wasn't bad, and I'd usually just put on my headphones and zone out. This story takes place during one of those nighttime walks home. It was late, probably close to 1 a.m., and I was walking back on the main road through town. My headphones were in, and I was in my own world. As I approached the park, I noticed a car sitting in the small parking lot. That struck me as odd because I never saw anyone else out at that hour. Most of the town was asleep by then. I brushed it off, figuring it was just someone passing through or taking a quick nap. Near the park entrance was a trail leading down to a river, and at the start of the trail was a bench. As I got closer, I saw a man step out from the trail and walk toward the bench. He looked to be in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were unremarkable, but something about him felt off. For one, he was wearing dark sunglasses, which was bizarre since it was pitch black outside. He quickly sat down on the bench, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was staring at me. I kept walking, slightly changing my path to give him some space. When I passed him, I tried to be polite and said, "Hey, how's it going?" He didn't respond. He just kept looking at me. That made my skin crawl. I walked faster, pulling one earbud out so I could stay more alert. About a quarter mile down the road, I glanced back, and he was following me. My stomach dropped. He was walking fast, closing the gap between us. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. But then I thought about the car I'd seen in the park. If that was his, why was he on foot? None of it made sense. When I looked back again, he was even closer, and now he was running. Adrenaline took over, and I broke into a full sprint. I darted off the road and into the woods, weaving through trees and bushes. I crouched down in a dense thicket, holding my breath and listening. I could hear him stomping through the forest, and then everything went quiet. I was terrified. He was probably trying to figure out where I was. Minutes passed, and then I heard him retreating toward the park. I waited a little longer before creeping back to the road. I checked both directions to make sure he wasn't there before continuing my walk home. The road was dark with no streetlights, so visibility was limited to about 50 feet. Even so, I felt a wave of relief, convinced I'd lost him. I kept walking and even put my headphones back in, trying to calm down. A few minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. A vehicle was approaching slowly. My heart raced as I braced for the worst. But when the car pulled up beside me, it wasn't him. It was a guy named Eric, someone I vaguely knew from town. He rolled down his window and asked, "Hey, need a ride?" At first, I hesitated. But then he said, "You know someone's been following you, right?" I froze and looked back. The man was there, not far behind, holding something shiny that glinted in Eric's taillights. I didn't need to be told twice. I jumped into Eric's car without saying a word. During the ride, I sat in silence, too shaken to speak. When we pulled into my driveway, Eric joked, "I probably just saved your life." He wasn't wrong. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted, but I'm grateful I never found out. After that night, I stopped staying out so late and made sure to stay aware of my surroundings. It's a reminder that no matter how safe a place feels, danger can come out of nowhere. Stay safe out there, everyone. The year was 2017. My close friend Jake and I, along with his teenage daughter Lily, decided to spend a night fishing at Lake Evergreen. It was an annual tradition every July, giving us a chance to unwind after a busy week. I'd meet Jake at his place, load my fishing tackle into his truck, and help him get his gear ready. It was something I always looked forward to, a way to relax and reconnect. Lily was just entering her final year of high school, eager to finish up and move on to bigger things. At the time, I was 30 years old and would often tell her to enjoy her youth because adult responsibilities weren't as fun as they seemed. Jake and I had been friends for over a decade, having worked together for most of that time. Our bond was more like family than friendship. As we headed out to our favorite fishing spot, I mentioned we needed to pick up more bait. Jake sighed, clearly annoyed. "Didn't you already get some?" he asked.
Isha pishli admita ide furguten.
We made a quick stop at a small bait shop in Riverwood to grab worms and a few other supplies before continuing on our way. The drive from the shop to the lake was about 40 minutes, but it felt much longer. When we finally arrived, there was a sign at the entrance that read, "Closed due to wildlife incident." The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trail leading to the water. Despite the warning, we decided to proceed. Jake and I always carried firearms when out in the wilderness, so we felt secure. Once we set up, the friendly competition began. Lily was the first to cast her line, boasting that she'd outfish both of us. Jake and I quickly followed suit, laughing and teasing each other. Hours passed in a blur of light-hearted banter about work, life, and everything in between. At one point, Lily stood up, saying she needed to use the bathroom. I handed her a flashlight and warned her not to wander too far. She disappeared into the trees, and soon after, we heard a faint thunk, thunk sound echoing in the distance. A chill ran through me. When Lily returned, Jake asked if she'd been making noises to spook us. She looked confused and denied it. The sound grew louder, thunk, thunk, and this time, it was unmistakably close. I grabbed the flashlight from Lily and shone it toward the noise. There was nothing visible, but moments later, a heavy object landed nearby with a loud thud. When we investigated, we found a large rock, easily weighing 15 pounds or more. Could this be a bear? Lily asked nervously. I shook my head. Bears don't throw rocks, I said, my unease growing. I drew my firearm just in case. For a while, the noises stopped. By then, it was nearly 2:30 a.m., and we debated packing up. Suddenly, another series of loud thumps broke the silence, followed by a bone-chilling sound, a mix of a howl and a scream. It was so close that it made my skin crawl. We hurriedly began packing our gear when another rock landed, this time right next to us. Lily begged, "Can we please just leave?" Jake and I nodded in agreement. As we made our way back to the truck, a massive splash erupted in the water nearby, as if something enormous had been thrown in. Heavy footsteps followed us, growing louder and closer. We kept moving, adrenaline pushing us forward. When we reached the truck, the windows had been shattered, and the tailgate was dented. I opened it to find a dead possum, mangled beyond recognition. The sight was horrifying, but we had no time to linger. Jake started the truck, and its headlights illuminated the woods ahead. That's when we saw it. Standing about 20 yards away was a massive figure, at least 8 feet tall, with glowing yellow eyes. Its fur was dark brown, and it held another large rock in one hand. The creature stared us down, its face twisted in anger. Jake began backing up the truck as the figure advanced. Lily screamed, "Go faster!" Jake floored it, and as we sped away, we heard a loud bang on the truck bed. We didn't stop until we were safely back at Jake's house. In the garage light, we saw the damage. A giant rock now sat in the truck bed, and the smell of wet fur and decay lingered. To this day, none of us have returned to that lake. We're more cautious now, heeding any warning signs we come across. It's been 6 years since that night, but the memory of what we saw and experienced remains vivid. I was riding a gondola with a retired military veteran a week ago. We struck up a conversation, and he shared that he had spent the past several years living in the rugged hills of Nebraska. Curious, I asked if he had ever come across any strange creatures in the area, drawing from a friend's story about a peculiar sighting in Nebraska. He said he hadn't encountered anything like that, although he had spent time studying the movements of buffalo and coyotes to better understand their patterns. However, he did share a chilling experience he once had that made him think he might have had a brush with something akin to a Wendigo, oddly enough, in Nebraska. He explained that there's an old trail through Nebraska tied to Native American and early settler history. He and a buddy had been hiking it during the seasonal bird migrations. Everything was going fine until the surroundings suddenly grew eerily silent. That's when he began to hear a woman's desperate screams echoing through the hills. Strangely, his hiking partner didn't seem to hear anything, even though the screams were piercing to him. "I think my friend thought I was losing my mind," he told me. But they both noted the eerie silence in an area that should have been alive with the noise of countless birds. The region was once home to the Pawnee people, who still reside in parts of the state today after land was officially set aside for them in the 19th century. He admitted he felt certain that something or someone was trying to lure him off the trail into the dense underbrush. "What's strange," he said, "is that my friend couldn't hear the screaming, even though it was so clear to me. I asked if he'd managed to see whatever was making the noise or figure out where it was coming from. Not exactly," he replied. "But as the day went on, we kept hearing strange noises. That night, things got even weirder. They hadn't encountered another soul for days, and that night he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Struggling to sleep, he lay in his tent with his sidearm, a .45 caliber pistol, at the ready, scanning the area for movement. He described catching a glimpse of a tall, shadowy figure moving between trees, its hand briefly extending around the trunk before retreating into the night. When he did manage to sleep, he was haunted by a recurring nightmare. In the dream, he was running through thick brush, desperately trying to escape an unseen pursuer. He remembered branches tearing at his skin and face as he ran. Each time he reached safety in the dream, it would start over again. This cycle of terror seemed endless until he awoke drenched in sweat, grabbing his weapon and scanning the campsite again. When dawn finally arrived, the two packed up and continued their hike without any further encounters. Still, the experience left him shaken. Years later, when he played a video game that featured creatures resembling Wendigos, it reignited his memories of that unsettling trip. According to various tribal legends, Wendigos are monstrous beings created through acts of greed, cannibalism, or other grave sins. The Pawnee, Sioux, and other native tribes tell of malevolent beings that dwell in the wilderness, preying on those who stray too far from safety. Descriptions vary, but many depict the creature as an elk-like predator with unnaturally long limbs and a sinister intelligence. Reports of eerie sounds, such as a baby's cry, a woman screaming, or voices repeating phrases like, "Help me" or "I'm hurt," are common in Wendigo lore. These sounds are said to lure victims into the wilderness. Some accounts even describe the creature mimicking the voice of a loved one or taking on an oddly distorted human-like form to deceive its prey. The veteran and I discussed these possibilities, along with other regional folklore about shapeshifters and other supernatural entities. The experience left him questioning what he encountered on that trail. But what do you think it was? My hunting adventure was one I'll never forget. It all started a few years back when I was 16. I'm 20 now, but I've never shared this experience with anyone until now. Hunting has always been a big part of my family's life, and it's something we do every year. We typically hunt various animals like deer, rabbits, squirrels, and wild boar. Out of everyone in the family, I've always been the one most skilled at hunting boars. The best time to hunt them is at night, and it's completely legal in our area. One evening, I was in a hunting stand, waiting for boars. During my watch, I spotted a deer and a couple of raccoons. They wandered into view, nibbling away for about 15 minutes before the deer left. The raccoons stayed behind for a while, but I began to feel restless. Then, all of a sudden, the raccoons bolted, as if something had spooked them. I thought maybe an owl had flown nearby and startled them, but I noticed something else. It was too quiet. I mean, completely silent. The stillness was unsettling. I had my night vision scope with me, so I started scanning the area using my .30-06 rifle. I should mention there's a creek near our shooting range, roughly 7 or 8 feet deep, which we use as a backstop to catch stray rounds. As I swept the area with my scope, I noticed something strange near the creek. I saw a pair of glowing eyes reflecting back at me. At first, I thought it might be a boar, and I prepared to take a shot. But as I kept watching, the thing I was looking at began climbing out of the creek. It was using hands, actual hands, and its head looked eerily human. I froze, watching as it pulled itself to the top and started moving toward the pile of corn we'd left out for the boars. This creature had the body of a man but was completely covered in fur. That's when it hit me. I was staring at something people only talked about in stories. It was a Bigfoot. Back then, I was a fearless 16-year-old, so I steadied my rifle and aimed at its chest. My heart was pounding as I squeezed the trigger. Boom. The gunshot echoed, and my ears rang. I was ecstatic, thinking I might have just become the first person to prove Bigfoot's existence. But my excitement quickly turned to dread. Over the ringing in my ears, I heard a deep, guttural roar that made my stomach drop. I peered through the scope again, but the creature was gone. I decided to stay in the stand until morning to investigate in the daylight. When dawn broke, I climbed down and walked to the spot where I'd fired the shot. I found a trail of blood and followed it. The trail seemed endless. I tracked it for nearly 2 hours. But then, I heard that roar again, loud and unearthly. The sound was followed by something heavy crashing into the ground, over and over. Rocks, massive ones, were being hurled in my direction. Panic set in, and I turned around, heading straight back to safety before one of those boulders could hit me. It took me almost an hour to get back, and the entire time, I felt like I was being watched. That encounter shook me to my core. I still go hunting, but I've switched to using an AR-15 for better firepower. However, one thing is for sure, I'll never hunt at night again. It was the late 1980s and I had just turned 16, a sophomore in high school. My group of friends decided to spend a night camping on a patch of land owned by one of their parents. We called it the River Cabin, though we never really stayed inside. Most of the time, we camped down by the riverbank near the woods. There were about 10 or 12 of us, a mix of guys and girls, all pretty close-knit. We weren't into sports. We preferred hanging out and partying. On this particular night, though, I was completely sober, which wasn't exactly common for me back then. Someone had brought along a Ouija board. I don't remember who owned it, but it was the same one that often made appearances at our hangouts. It was late when we decided to use it. All the girls except me and my friend Karen were asleep. A couple of the guys were still awake, but they weren't paying attention to us. They were off on some wild trip, thanks to their buddy LSD. Karen and I lay on our stomachs on sleeping bags near the fire and set up the board. We asked, "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette moved quickly, spelling out JSTR. "Jester," I said aloud. "All right, Jester, what's up?" The planchette moved again, spelling KLLYOU. We laughed it off, thinking the other was moving the planchette as a joke. Seemed absurd. I decided to mock the supposed spirit. "Oh yeah? And how exactly are you going to do that?" The planchette spelled out Tari. "How are you going to kill me with a tree?" I scoffed. No sooner had I said those words than a heavy branch from the large oak above us came crashing down, landing vertically between my legs like a spear. We screamed in shock but didn't stop playing. Instead, we moved to the other side of the fire, still shaken but too curious to stop. I asked, "Well, that didn't work. What's your next plan to kill me?" This time, the board spelled FIRE. As soon as we read the word, the nearby campfire suddenly flared up, flames surging toward us. That was enough to end the session. We said a hasty goodbye to the spirit and left the Ouija board alone for the rest of the night. But that wasn't the last I saw of Jester. Later that summer, my sister and I were hanging out in the back room of our stepdad's workshop with our friends Cindy and Lisa. The room had 2 sets of bunk beds, a stepladder, and a bare concrete floor. It was daytime and Cindy brought out the Ouija board. We started asking it random, silly questions, typical teenage stuff. Then someone asked who we were talking to. My stomach dropped when the planchette spelled out Jstr. Feigning confidence, I said, "Oh, it's you again. Still trying to kill me?" The planchette pointed to yes. This time, I wasn't taking any chances. I immediately moved the planchette to goodbye, and we put the board away. That evening, my sister left to stay with her mom, leaving me alone in the bunk room. As I drifted off to sleep, I was startled awake. My eyes shot open and I froze in terror. Spiders, hundreds of them, had woven webs from the head of my bed to the foot, completely covering the top bunk where I lay. One spider dangled from the ceiling, lowering itself toward my face. I rolled off the bed in a panic, forgetting I was on the top bunk. Somehow, I managed to catch myself just before hitting my head on the stepladder below. I scrambled to turn on the lights, only to find nothing. The spiders were gone. If I hadn't caught myself, I might have broken my neck on the stepladder. No one would have found me until morning. Since that night, I've refused to go near a Ouija board. Be cautious when you tempt whatever might linger beyond our world. This incident occurred about 4 years ago. I'm 18 now, but it still haunts me. It happened on my 14th birthday, and I'll never forget it. I live in a quiet town in Pennsylvania, and back then, I had a close-knit group of 8 friends. I was turning 14 and was thrilled about the party my mom and I had planned. We decided to hold the celebration at a small cabin in the woods. My mom rented the place, which had a cozy kitchen, a small living room with a TV, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. It was serene, tucked away from the bustle of town. Mom and I spent the morning decorating, hanging fairy lights, streamers, and pastel-colored balloons to give it a whimsical feel. Soon, there was a knock at the door, and my friends started arriving. I was especially excited to see my best friend, Matteo. I greeted everyone warmly and invited them inside. Mom had already ordered pizza, which we devoured while sitting together and chatting. Later, Mom mentioned she had to run back into town for a couple of hours. She hesitated, worried about leaving us alone in the cabin. But I reassured her we were responsible enough and promised to keep everything locked up tight. Once she left, we built a small fire outside to roast marshmallows and make s'mores. We were having the time of our lives, sharing spooky stories around the fire. One of my friends, Emma, started recounting a chilling tale about a local urban legend, a mysterious woman who vanished years ago. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the eerie mood. Then, unexpectedly, Liam revealed something personal. He told us his parents divorced after he came out as gay. While his mom was supportive, his dad reacted horribly. Things got so bad that his mom had to get a restraining order. As Liam told his story, he looked on the verge of tears. To comfort him, we asked what his father looked like. Hesitantly, he showed us a photo on his phone. A little while later, a strange sound broke the moment, loud crunching from the woods. The nearest house was miles away, so we were immediately uneasy. "What was that?" Matteo asked, his voice tight. I tried to stay calm and replied, "Probably just an animal." But Ethan, always the daring one, shook his head. "No way," he whispered. "That's not how animals sound when they move." We returned to the cabin, trying to shrug it off, but the noise grew louder and closer. Inside, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows. To distract ourselves, we started binge-watching anime. After a few hours, we all decided to head to bed. Some of us slept upstairs, while a few, including Matteo, Emma, Ryan, and me, stayed in the living room. I was scrolling through my phone when I felt drowsy. Just as I started drifting off, loud, urgent banging on the door jolted us awake. We froze. The cabin didn't have a peephole, so we couldn't see who or what was outside. The banging shifted to the living room window. A tapping sound followed, growing louder. I cautiously peeked through the curtain and froze in terror. A tall, shirtless man, wearing nothing but old jeans, was staring back at me. He held a hunting rifle and smiled, waving mockingly. Then he pointed at the door as if demanding I let him in. My stomach dropped when I realized it was Liam's father. Panicked, I ran to wake the others. We told everyone what was happening. Liam was horrified when I said his father's name. Tears filled his eyes, and he started trembling. As we tried to calm him down, more pounding echoed from the door, followed by a chilling voice. "Open up, kids!" We scrambled for phones to call the police, but the signal was weak. Meanwhile, we armed ourselves with whatever we could find. Kitchen knives, a baseball bat, even a can of pepper spray. Suddenly, the man started kicking at the door. After a few kicks, he broke through, shouting that he'd kill us all. Acting quickly, I grabbed the pepper spray and ran to the door. I sprayed him in the face, causing him to stumble back, screaming. Then Mateo yelled, "Lena, now!" I swung the bat with all my strength, knocking him unconscious. We barricaded ourselves in a bedroom and finally managed to call 911. The operator assured us help was on the way. Minutes felt like hours until flashing lights appeared outside. Police officers swarmed the cabin and took Liam's father into custody. Later, we learned he had been under the influence of drugs and had planned to harm us. Thankfully, none of us were physically hurt, but the emotional scars ran deep. Liam has since started therapy, and though it's been years, that night remains etched in our memories. I'll always be grateful for our quick thinking and teamwork. We were lucky to make it out safely. On a humid late summer day in South Carolina, my wife, our 7-year-old daughter, and I decided to go camping. Instead of visiting a regular campsite, we opted for a more secluded experience. We had heard of an old campsite that had been shut down for years, untended and forgotten. Intrigued, we decided to explore it. Upon arriving, we saw that the gate near the weather check-in booth was secured with a chain. This meant we had to leave our vehicle in the tree line and carry our gear in on foot. After a brief walk, we noticed remnants of old camping areas. Moss-covered tables, rusting fire pits, and other signs of neglect. We pressed on, looking for a spot close to a pond, and eventually found an ideal location after about a 20-minute trek from the car. That evening was uneventful. As night fell, our daughter went to sleep in the tent while my wife and I sat by the fire. The isolation was almost unnerving. Complete silence stretched for miles around us. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by a series of 6 heavy, deliberate steps coming from the direction of the pond. It sounded like someone stepping out of the water and trudging onto the shore. At first, I assumed it might be a forest ranger or perhaps a local officer who had spotted our car and tracked us down. But the sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard from a person or an animal. It wasn't the scuttling of a raccoon, the steps of a deer, or the splash of a beaver. It was deliberate, heavy, and disconcerting. My wife, who is normally calm and collected, was visibly shaken. I stood up, feeling a deep sense of unease. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed a flashlight along with a camping knife. Shining the beam into the trees, we searched for the source of the noise but found nothing. The forest around us remained eerily still. I called out, my voice trembling slightly, "Hello!" My question hung in the air, unanswered. The oppressive silence was then broken by a sharp series of cracking sounds. Branches snapping, not underfoot but overhead. Pine cones began to rain down, hitting the ground around us with unnerving precision. It sounded as if dozens of creatures had suddenly swarmed the treetops, though no movement was visible when we directed our lights upwards. The noise seemed to come from all directions at once, from the water, from the trees, and from the shadows. No animal sounds accompanied it, No grunts, growls, or chirps, just an unnatural, chaotic din that left us paralyzed with fear. It felt as though we were being surrounded or hunted by something beyond comprehension. My instinct was to grab our daughter and flee, abandoning everything except what we could carry. But we were far from the car, and the thought of running blindly through the dark woods with an unknown presence lurking nearby was paralyzing. Instead, we retreated into the tent, huddling together and waiting for whatever might come next. The bizarre noises continued throughout the night, shifting in intensity and location. Sometimes they seemed close, other times distant, but they never ceased. By the time dawn broke, the sounds stopped abruptly. Exhausted but desperate for answers, we ventured back to the pond to investigate. Near the water, we found something chilling. A large fallen tree trunk that had been gouged and slashed in a way that defied explanation. The marks were fresh, deep, and jagged, as though a massive blade or claw had been used repeatedly. They hadn't been there the day before. We quickly packed our belongings and left the campsite without looking back. To this day, we've never been able to explain what we experienced. Whatever happened at that abandoned campsite was beyond anything natural. Perhaps there's a reason it was shut down in the first place. Years later, the memory still sends shivers down my spine.